The low growl of Shadow filled the silence of the Texas night. Ethan Cole jolted awake, heart hammering, sweat soaking through his t-shirt. For a split second, the old instincts came back, the battlefield reflexes, the split-second awareness that had kept him alive in Afghanistan. He reached for the flashlight on the dashboard of his battered pickup. The beam cut across the cracked windshield, catching the outline of Shadow, ears pricked, eyes locked on the shadows outside. It wasn't a battlefield. It was a Walmart parking lot. A group of teenagers were laughing as they rattled the handle of an abandoned shopping cart just feet from Ethan's truck. The sound was harmless, but Shadow's growl said otherwise. Ethan placed a steadying hand on the shepherd's back. "It's okay, buddy," he whispered. His voice was rough, like sandpaper. Shadow's body stiffened, then slowly relaxed, though the dog's eyes never left the movement outside. The kids eventually wandered off, their laughter echoing into the distance, leaving Ethan and his dog alone in the dark. He let out a long breath and leaned back against the seat. The smell of old fast food wrappers and engine oil mixed in the stale air. 3 weeks of living in the truck had reduced his world to this confined space. A backpack of clothes in the back seat, a half-empty duffel bag with tools, and Shadow always shadow-pressed close enough that Ethan could feel the dog's warmth against his arm. Only months earlier, he'd been someone else entirely. Ethan Cole, decorated combat engineer, the guy who built things no one else could. After leaving the army, he poured his discipline and savings into a construction company in Dallas. For a while, it looked like the dream every soldier had when they hung up the uniform. Contracts lined up. Investors called. He even drove a new F-150, and Rachel, his wife, liked to joke that she'd married into the American dream twice. Once when he wore the uniform, and again when he wore the suit. But dreams fracture fast. The resort deal in Colorado had been the turning point. An ambitious project, promised funding, flashy investors with smiles too wide to trust. Ethan staked everything on it, leveraging his company, their home, even borrowing against Rachel's real estate ventures. When the investors pulled out, the collapse was brutal. Lawsuits rained down. Subcontractors demanded payment. Banks circled like vultures. Ethan fought as long as he could, but every call with the lawyer left him more gutted. And Rachel, she started slipping away. First her laughter disappeared. Then the quiet dinners stretched into silence. The morning she left, she didn't slam doors or scream. She just left a folded note on the kitchen table. "I can't do this anymore. I can't watch you drown. I'm sorry, no signature. No goodbye. Just absence." Ethan had read it over and over until the words blurred. The only constant was Shadow's steady gaze from the doorway, ears tilted, waiting for a command. Ethan crouched down, clutched the thick fur of the shepherd's neck, and whispered the truth he could barely admit to himself. "It's just you and me now." By the time the bank took the house, Ethan and Shadow had already moved into the truck. The repo men had hauled off the furniture, the TV, even the washer Rachel had fought to keep. Ethan stood across the street, watching deputies tape foreclosure notices to the door of a place that had once been filled with laughter and plans for the future. Shadow pressed against his leg, silent, steady. Now nights blurred into each other. Gas station coffee in the morning, long stretches of highway with no destination, fast food for dinner. The dog never complained. Shadow lay in the passenger seat with the patience of a soldier, eyes scanning the world outside, ready for anything. He seemed to understand more than any human could that his handler had lost everything except the will to keep moving. One evening, Ethan parked near a rest stop, tucked into the Colorado mountains. The last of the sun painted the sky in streaks of red and gold, and for a moment, the quiet pressed in too heavy. He sat on the hood, hands buried in his jacket, staring at the peaks. Was this all a mistake? He muttered. Shadow padded up beside him, sitting tall, chest out, ears forward. The shepherd didn't flinch at the wind cutting across the valley. He just stared into the same horizon as if daring the mountains to test them. Ethan's throat tightened. The man who had built bridges under fire now couldn't build a life for himself. Shame pressed down on him like body armor he couldn't take off. He thought of his brother in Phoenix, his sister in Seattle, both thriving. How could he call them and admit he was sleeping in parking lots? That night, wrapped in an old army blanket, he drifted in and out of dreams. In one, he was back in Helmand, sand in his mouth, explosions in his ears. He woke with Shadow's wet nose nudging his hand, the dog's eyes sharp, pulling him back from the edge of panic. "Good boy," Ethan whispered, breath shaky. "You always know." He sat in the truck, staring at the map on his phone. His grandfather's voice floated up from memory, gravelly and sure. The mountains are where a man can disappear, where he can think straight again. Ethan zoomed in on a name. Bitterroot Ridge, Montana. A dot in the wilderness. There was no logic in it, no plan, but the thought stuck. He turned to Shadow. "What do you think? Want to see what's up there?" The dog tilted his head, eyes glinting in the beam of the flashlight. Then he yawned, stretched, and rested his head on Ethan's knee. It wasn't a yes. It wasn't a no. It was trust. And in that trust, Ethan felt something stir. Not hope, not yet, but the faint memory of it. The road north cut through endless stretches of asphalt and silence, each mile pulling Ethan further from the wreckage of his old life. The pickup rattled on cracked pavement, its engine groaning under the weight of tools, a few supplies, and a future that had no blueprint. Shadow sat upright in the passenger seat, alert, as if the German shepherd understood this wasn't just another aimless drive. His head tilted every time Ethan shifted gears, his ears twitching at the faintest sound outside, ready to act at the first sign of trouble. Ethan gripped the wheel harder than necessary. His grandfather's voice echoed in his mind, words carried from boyhood campfires. The old man had been a woodsman, tough as oak and twice as stubborn. Up in Montana there are cabins no one remembers. Log walls built by hands long gone. If a man ever needs to disappear, the mountains will take him in if he's willing to work. Ethan had brushed it off then, a teenager too restless to imagine needing a place to hide. Now the words felt like a lifeline. 3 nights ago, in a gas station lot outside Cheyenne, he had decided. No more drifting from rest stop to rest stop. No more watching Shadow sleep on the truck floor while strangers eyed them with pity. If there really was a forgotten cabin out there, he would find it. Maybe it was foolish, maybe even desperate. But at least it was something. The drive through Wyoming into Montana grew lonelier with every passing mile. Gas stations thinned out. Towns shrank to nothing but shuttered diners and rusting grain silos. Cell service blinked in and out, leaving him with only static on the radio. Yet with every mile north, his chest felt a fraction lighter, as if the shame and suffocation of Dallas couldn't keep up. At one point, Ethan pulled into a dirt turnout overlooking a stretch of pine forest. The wind cut sharp and cold across the hood of the truck. He leaned against the door, staring into the endless green. Shadow jumped down, paws crunching against gravel, nose to the air. The dog moved with purpose, scanning the horizon as if confirming this was the right direction. "You think he was right?" Ethan murmured, watching his partner sniff the ground, tail flicking with restrained energy. "You think there's still something up here for us?" Shadow looked back, eyes locked onto Ethan's. There was no wag this time, no playful bark, just quiet certainty. By late afternoon, the paved road dwindled into gravel, then into a dirt track, barely wide enough for the truck. Branches scraped the sides, pine needles rained across the windshield. Twice, Ethan had to climb out with an axe to clear fallen limbs. Shadow stood guard each time, head low, muscles tense, ears swiveling at every crack of branches deeper in the woods. The wilderness pressed close, a living thing that seemed to watch them pass. The track climbed higher, switchbacks carved into the mountainside. The truck shuddered, threatening to stall on the steeper inclines. Ethan's knuckles whitened around the wheel, but he pressed on. This had to lead somewhere. And then it did. The trees broke suddenly into a clearing, and Ethan slammed the brakes. The cabin stood on a rise above a meadow, framed by aspens and backed by jagged peaks dusted with late spring snow. For a moment, he thought it was an illusion. The roof sagged badly, windows were nothing but jagged glass, and a section of the porch had collapsed. Moss crept up the logs, vines clawed across one wall, but it was standing. Shadow leapt from the truck before Ethan had opened the door, bounding toward the cabin with the energy of a dog discovering a world made just for him. He circled the perimeter, nose to ground, ears flicking, then barked once, sharp and decisive, as if announcing the place belonged to them now. Ethan walked slowly, boots sinking into damp earth. Up close, the cabin looked worse. The roof had holes big enough to let in a downpour. The door hung on one hinge. A tree had grown so close on one side that its branches punched straight through a broken window. It was ruined. But it was also solid. The foundation stones were tight, untouched by decades of frost. The logs beneath the dirt and moss were thick and still strong. He pressed a palm against one, feeling the rough grain under his skin. For the first time in months, something inside him stirred. Hope. A sharp crack shattered the moment. From the tree line, a deer bolted, white tail flashing as it bounded into the brush. Shadow lunged forward, barking furiously, but stopped when Ethan called his name. The shepherd froze, then trotted back, chest heaving, eyes bright. "You saw it before I did," Ethan whispered, crouching to rub the dog's neck. "This place has life in it still, doesn't it?" That night, they didn't sleep in the truck. Ethan unrolled his blanket on the cabin floor, despite the holes in the roof that let the stars in like cold lanterns. He lay awake, listening to the wind sigh through broken windows, the creak of old timbers, and Shadow's steady breathing beside him. The mountain was silent, but it wasn't empty. It felt like it was waiting. Ethan stared at the ceiling until the stars blurred. His body ached from the drive. His future was a question mark. But for the first time since everything collapsed, he wasn't drowning. He was somewhere that could either kill him or save him. Shadow shifted, pressing against his side, warm and solid. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's back, grounding himself in that steady presence. "Maybe this is it," he murmured into the darkness. "Maybe this is where we start over." Shadow's ears flicked at the sound of his voice, but the shepherd didn't move. Outside, the mountains loomed, vast and indifferent, but Ethan felt them press closer, almost as if they were listening. The first night inside the cabin felt less like shelter and more like a dare. The roof leaked in 3 different places, sending cold drops down onto Ethan's blanket. The wind rattled the broken shutters, and the door groaned with every gust, its hinge hanging by a single rusted nail. He had patched holes with scraps of tarp, but the air seeped in all the same. Shadow lay beside him on the warped wooden floor, head lifted, ears swiveling at every sound. The dog refused to sleep deeply, as if he knew the mountain was still testing them. Ethan had spent the day hauling in what little food he had. Canned beans, jerky, coffee, and a few bags of trail mix. He stored them in a wooden shed just 20 yards from the cabin, its walls grey and splintered with age, but at least standing. He told himself it would hold until he could build something stronger. By the time the fire in the stone hearth had burned to embers, exhaustion pulled at him like gravity. He drifted, Shadow's steady breathing close enough to feel. The sound that woke him wasn't loud at first, just a scrape, like wood being dragged across the ground. Shadow was on his feet instantly, a deep rumble rising from his chest. His hackles stood up, and in the dim light his teeth caught the flicker of fire. Ethan blinked himself awake, instincts snapping into place. He grabbed the flashlight and flicked it towards the door. The noise grew louder, splintering wood, heavy, deliberate. Shadow snarled, pressing his body against the door, as if daring whatever was outside to try him first. Ethan's pulse pounded. He eased the door open a crack, beam cutting through the dark. A massive black bear loomed over the shed, claws tearing through the old boards as if they were paper. The beast's head swung toward the cabin at the sudden light, eyes reflecting like molten amber. Ethan froze, breath caught. The bear snorted, then returned to ripping into the shed, drawn by the scent of food. Shadow lunged forward, only stopped by Ethan's grip on his collar. The shepherd barked, sharp and fierce, chest pressed against the doorway. Ethan crouched low, whispering hoarsely, "Not yet." Not like this. He could feel the dog's muscles vibrating under his hand, every fiber of him straining to protect. The bear slammed a shoulder into the shed, boards exploding outward. Jerky, beans, and trail mix scattered across the dirt. Ethan's stomach twisted. That food had to last weeks. If it was gone, survival here would be less than a gamble. He weighed his options, rush the bear, fire a shot from his pistol, try to scare it off, but memories from Afghanistan reminded him of the danger in rash moves. Improvised decisions had cost men their lives. Shadow barked again, so loud the sound seemed to echo across the clearing. The bear paused, head swinging back toward the cabin. For one tense second, its bulk shifted toward them. Ethan braced, flashlight trembling in his grip, the dog coiled like a spring. But then the bear snorted and lumbered back to the scattered food, unconcerned by their defiance. For nearly an hour they watched helplessly as the animal devoured everything it wanted and scattered the rest. Shadow never once relaxed, standing like a soldier on guard, his growl low and steady. Ethan kept his hand tight on the dog's collar, knowing Shadow would have thrown himself against the beast without hesitation if given the chance. When the bear finally moved off, melting into the trees, the silence that followed was suffocating. Ethan stepped out, flashlight beam cutting across the wreckage. The shed was ruined, its door hanging by a single hinge, food trampled and destroyed. His heart sank as the reality hit him. He had gambled everything on this mountain, and already it was slipping away. Shadow padded forward, nose to the ground, sniffing the ruined supplies. He looked back at Ethan, eyes sharp and steady, as if waiting for orders. "Yeah," Ethan muttered, voice rough. "I get it." Lesson 1. We're not in charge here, not yet. He gathered what little was salvageable, shoving cans into a pack, shaking dirt from torn bags. Shadow circled the perimeter, every sense alive, scanning the tree line as if daring the bear to come back. His presence steadied Ethan, anchoring him against the rising tide of panic. Back inside the cabin, Ethan dropped onto the blanket, staring into the dying embers. His hands shook, not from cold, but from the realization of how fragile this new life was. One storm, one bear, one mistake, and it could all collapse. He looked at Shadow, who lay across the doorway now, head resting on his paws, but eyes still glowing in the dark. "You're not just a dog," Ethan whispered. "You're my warning, my shield. Without you, I wouldn't have made it through tonight." Shadow's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, and the shepherd let out a quiet sigh, heavy and reassuring. As the mountain wind howled through the broken shutters, Ethan understood something he hadn't before. This wasn't just about survival. It wasn't about outlasting the cold or patching holes in the roof. It was about proving to himself and to the dog who refused to abandon him that he could still stand. That soldier's grit wasn't gone, only buried. The cabin might have been collapsing, and the food nearly gone, but inside its failing walls, Ethan felt the faint stirrings of resolve. The mountain had thrown down its first challenge. He and Shadow had endured it together. And tomorrow, they would begin again. Morning came grey and raw, a thin mist curling over the meadow, as if the mountain itself wanted to see what this intruder would do next. Ethan stood outside the wrecked cabin, arms crossed against the chill, surveying the ruin with a soldier's eye. The bear raid had left him shaken, but it also left him with a choice. Quit now, or fight back with hammer and grit. He knew only one answer. The cabin was salvageable, though just barely. The foundation stones had held through decades of storms, and the logs, though weathered, were still solid under layers of moss. The roof, though, sagged like a dying man's chest, and holes in the walls whistled with every gust. Ethan ran a hand across one of the beams, the grain rough beneath his palm, and muttered to himself, "All right. We're going to rebuild you. One nail at a time." Shadow padded up, tail wagging once, his amber eyes sharp and watchful. The shepherd had been pacing the perimeter all morning, ears flicking at unseen things in the trees. Now he stood beside Ethan, nudging his hand as if to remind him he wasn't in this alone. Ethan scratched behind his ear. "Guess you're my foreman now." The first task was the roof. Ethan hauled his tools from the truck, a battered toolbox, a crowbar, and a handsaw dull from years of neglect. The nails rattled in an old coffee tin. He lacked half of what he needed, but improvisation had kept him alive overseas, and it would have to work here. He climbed the sagging roof with a coil of rope slung over his shoulder. Each step groaned under his weight, threatening to give way. Shadow circled below, barking once as if warning him to watch his footing. "I hear you!" Ethan called down. "Don't worry. I've done worse on sandbags and IED craters by midday." Sweat streaked his back despite the mountain chill. He pried off rusted sheets of tin and tossed them into a heap. Shadow leapt aside each time with practiced grace, then nosed the pile as if checking the damage. Ethan worked until his arms burned, replacing rotten beams with what he could salvage from the collapsed porch. When his strength flagged, Shadow sat at the base of the ladder, eyes locked on him, steady and grounding. That night, with the roof patched enough to keep most of the rain out, Ethan built his first real fire in the stone hearth. He cooked beans in a dented pot, the scent filling the cabin with something like comfort. Shadow lay near the flames, paws stretched out, muzzle resting on his forelegs, eyes half closed but still alert. Every so often he lifted his head, sniffed the air, then returned to his vigil. The next days fell into rhythm. Mornings were for chopping wood, the axe biting into pine with a satisfying crack. Shadow chased chips that flew too far, snapping them up and dropping them back at Ethan's boots. "Good help," Ethan chuckled, sweat dripping into his eyes. Afternoons were for sealing gaps in the walls, stuffing moss and mud into the cracks until the wind no longer howled through the cabin. Shadow inspected each section, nose twitching, as though approving his work. Evenings ended with the two of them sitting on the porch steps, watching the sun drop behind the ridgeline. But the mountain wasn't finished testing him. On the fourth day, as Ethan worked on fitting a new hinge to the door, Shadow stiffened, growl rumbling deep in his chest. Ethan froze. He followed the shepherd's gaze to the tree line, where a dark shape moved. For a heartbeat, he thought the bear had returned. His hand closed over the hammer instinctively. The shape broke into light. A cow elk, antlers flashing as it bounded away. Ethan exhaled hard, nerves jangling. Shadow didn't move until the animal had vanished. Then he looked back at Ethan, eyes sharp, chest still heaving. You've got better instincts than me, Ethan admitted quietly. Keep me honest, okay? By the end of the week, the cabin no longer looked like a ruin. The roof held, the door shut firm. The hearth gave off steady heat. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Ethan stood in the doorway one evening, arms aching from work, watching Shadow patrol the clearing. The shepherd's body moved with the precision of training and the freedom of wilderness, muscles rippling beneath his dark coat. He paused often, nose lifted, as if claiming every inch of the land for them. Ethan felt a flicker of something he hadn't in months, pride. Not the hollow pride of contracts signed or bank accounts fattened. This was different, earned with sweat, calloused hands, and the silent partnership of a dog who refused to leave his side. He knelt in the dirt as Shadow returned, dropping down to meet the shepherd's eyes. "We might just make it here," he said softly. Shadow leaned into him, pressing the weight of his head against Ethan's chest. In that moment, under the fading light of the Montana sky, Ethan realized the mountain had given him more than a challenge. It had given him back the will to fight. And with Shadow as his constant sentinel, he was ready. The nights were the worst. By day, Ethan kept himself too busy to think. He split wood, patched the roof, dragged logs through the clearing until his muscles screamed. But when the fire died low and the mountain silence pressed in, the memories crept back. The desert heat, the deafening blast of roadside bombs, the taste of metal dust in his mouth. That night it hit harder than usual. He dreamed of the convoy again. He saw the truck in front of his explode, a burst of orange and sand. He heard the screams. He felt himself running toward the wreckage, Shadow's earlier counterpart straining against his harness, and then just black smoke and silence. Ethan bolted upright on the cabin floor, chest heaving, throat raw from shouting. Sweat drenched his shirt. Shadow was already on him, pressing his body against Ethan's side, whining softly. The dog nudged him with his nose, insistent, grounding him back in the present. Ethan clutched Shadow's collar as if it were a lifeline. "You pulled me out again," Ethan whispered, voice shaking. "You always do." Shadow licked his wrist once, then settled with his weight, pressed heavy against Ethan's chest, as if refusing to let the ghosts reclaim him. Ethan lay awake until dawn, hand buried in the dog's fur, the pounding of his heart slowly easing. 2 days later, the past came calling in a different way. Ethan was stacking firewood when Shadow's bark split the air, sharp and urgent. He turned to see a figure moving through the aspens, rifle slung casually over one shoulder. For an instant, Ethan's body tensed like he was back in Helmand, a stranger approaching in unknown terrain. Shadow darted ahead, hackles raised, growling low. "Whoa there!" the man called, lifting a hand. "Don't shoot." Just hunting elk, he stepped into the clearing, face weathered, beard streaked grey. His eyes found Ethan, then widened with recognition. "Cole." Ethan Cole. Ethan froze. The voice reached into a part of his memory he had walled off. "Tommy." It was. Sergeant Tom Gallagher Tommy to everyone in their old unit. They had built bridges together under fire, patched roads with mortars still falling in the distance. Ethan hadn't seen him since the last deployment, years ago. They clasped forearms, a rough soldier's handshake, though Ethan felt the old weight pressing down again. "Hell," Tommy said, glancing around the clearing. "Last I heard you were running some big outfit in Texas. Now you're up here building a cabin?" "Something like that," Ethan muttered. Shadow didn't take his eyes off the stranger. His body blocked Ethan's leg, ready to move if needed. Tommy crouched, extending a hand. "Still got that shepherd magic." "What's his name?" "Shadow," Ethan answered. The dog didn't budge, gaze locked on Tommy's face. Ethan rested a hand on the shepherd's back. "He doesn't warm up fast." Not anymore. They sat by the fire that night, trading pieces of their stories. Tommy spoke of drifting from job to job, never quite landing after the army. Hunting in the Montana backcountry was his way of finding quiet. Ethan said little. He didn't mention Rachel. He didn't talk about bankruptcy or the foreclosure. But the silence between his words spoke volumes. At one point, Tommy looked at him across the fire. "You still have the dreams, don't you?" Ethan's jaw tightened. Shadow stirred, resting his head across Ethan's knee as if sensing the storm building inside. Tommy nodded slowly. "Me too. Still see Martinez's face. Still hear that blast." His voice broke off, eyes staring into the flames. "Doesn't matter how far we run." "The war follows." Ethan said nothing. His fingers curled into Shadow's thick fur, anchoring himself. Later that night, Ethan woke again to his own voice echoing in the cabin, a shout he couldn't remember making. Shadow was already on his chest, licking his face, whining low. Through the haze of panic, Ethan saw movement outside the window, a shadowy figure lingering near the tree line. His hand shot toward the pistol by his bedroll. He burst out the door barefoot, flashlight beam slicing the darkness. The light caught Tommy, rifle slung, standing too close to the cabin. "What the hell are you doing?" Ethan barked. Tommy raised his free hand, blinking against the glare. "Couldn't sleep. Just needed air." Ethan's heart hammered. Shadow growled, teeth bared, body angled between Ethan and Tommy. For a moment, the scene was too close to the Dream 2 soldiers, one dog, the smell of danger thick in the night air. Tommy shifted, uneasy. "You've still got it bad," he said quietly. "Maybe worse than me." Ethan lowered the light, but the suspicion lingered. He had let the past walk back into his world, and now it prowled around his cabin like a restless ghost. Inside, as Shadow finally settled at the door, Ethan lay awake staring at the ceiling. He knew now that survival here wasn't just about bears or weather. It was about fighting the war that refused to end. And with Tommy's sudden reappearance, the lines between memory and reality had blurred more than ever. Shadow's steady breathing filled the cabin, but Ethan couldn't shake the thought that both of them had just been pulled deeper into a battle, neither asked to fight again. The first real snow came early, a blinding curtain that erased the world beyond the cabin door. By morning, the meadow was buried under 2 feet of powder, and the path to the creek vanished in a sweep of white. Ethan had known winter in Montana would be brutal, but nothing prepared him for how quickly the mountain turned against him. The cabin groaned beneath the weight. Each gust of wind rattled the patched roof, sending a fine mist of frost through cracks in the walls. Ethan worked from dawn to dusk, chopping wood, stacking it as high as he could, but the pile seemed to shrink faster than he could replenish it. Every night the fire roared in the hearth, and still the cold seeped in, gnawing at his bones. Shadow adapted quicker. His thick coat grew heavier, his paws tough against the ice. He patrolled the perimeter, leaving paw prints that vanished as fast as the snow fell. At night he curled beside Ethan, pressing his warmth against him, the steady rhythm of his breathing a reminder that they weren't entirely at the mercy of the storm. Then the blizzard hit. It came without warning, sweeping down from the peaks in a wall of wind and snow. For 3 days, the world disappeared. The cabin shuddered as if under siege, the roof creaking like a ship in heavy seas. Ethan stuffed rags into gaps, nailed blankets over windows, but still the icy air poured in. At night, when the fire sank low, his breath turned to mist and frost rimed the inside of the walls. On the second night, the chimney clogged with ice. Smoke poured back into the room, choking him awake. He stumbled through the haze, coughing, while Shadow barked, circling him, nudging him towards the door. Together they forced it open, snow crashing inside as they gasped for air. Ethan fell to his knees in the drift, chest heaving, while Shadow stood half-buried beside him, muzzle coated white, eyes locked on him as if to say, "Keep moving." By dawn, the storm showed no sign of breaking. The firewood was nearly gone, and Ethan's hands shook from more than cold. He sat against the wall, blanket pulled tight, staring at the dim orange glow in the hearth. His mind whispered what he hadn't dared say aloud. They weren't going to make it. He closed his eyes and saw Rachel's letter again, the one left on the kitchen table. He heard the snap of IEDs in the desert, smelled the burning sand, felt the weight of failure pressing down, all of it stacked on his chest until the only thought left was surrender. He looked at the door. It would be easy, almost peaceful to stop fighting. Just let the storm do what it wanted. No more shame, no more ghosts. Then Shadow moved. The shepherd pressed his head into Ethan's lap, eyes locked on his with a clarity that pierced through the fog. There was no panic in those eyes, no despair, only expectation, the same steady demand Shadow had carried since Afghanistan. "Get up. Keep going." Ethan felt the tremor in his own hands ease as he buried them in the dog's thick fur. Shadow whined low, not a plea but a command. "All right." Ethan rasped. "All right, boy." We fight the next hours blurred into desperate work. Ethan hacked at frozen logs until his arms gave out, dragging them inside, feeding the fire until it roared again. He climbed onto the roof in the teeth of the gale, hammering the chimney clear while Shadow paced below, barking at each slip of his boot. His face burned from the cold, his lungs seared, but the dog never let him stop. When the storm finally broke on the fourth morning, silence returned, heavy and absolute. The cabin still stood, scarred but intact. Ethan slumped against the door frame, every muscle trembling. Shadow stood beside him, chest heaving, fur plastered with ice, but his tail lifted once in quiet triumph. Ethan reached down, cupping the shepherd's muzzle in both hands. "We almost quit," he whispered, "but you didn't let me." The dog licked the salt from his cracked lips, steady as ever. Ethan pulled him close, forehead against Shadow's, breath mingling in the frozen air. For the first time, Ethan understood the truth. The mountain wasn't just testing him. It was forging him anew, and Shadow was the steel keeping him from breaking. They hadn't just survived the winter siege. They had earned their place here, together. The storm had stripped everything bare. Branches littered the meadow, drifts of snow still clung to the cabin walls, and the air carried that strange silence that follows catastrophe. Ethan moved stiffly through the wreckage, shoulders aching from days of fighting the blizzard. Shadow stayed close, nose working constantly, tail low, but steady. They had survived, but the cabin still looked more like a scar than a home. Ethan was dragging a half-frozen log towards the woodpile when Shadow froze. His ears pricked, body stiff, eyes locked on the tree line. A moment later, Ethan heard two crunching footsteps on the crusted snow. His pulse quickened. After the long winter, the last thing he expected was company. He wiped his hands on his coat and grabbed the axe, more out of instinct than threat. A figure emerged from the aspens, bundled in a red parka, snowshoes strapped awkwardly to her boots. She carried a camera slung around her neck and stopped short at the sight of the cabin, eyes widening. "Well, I'll be damned," she said, breathless from the climb. "Somebody actually lives here." Shadow moved forward a step, growling low, body angled in front of Ethan. The shepherd's fur bristled, amber eyes fixed on the stranger. Ethan rested a calming hand on his back. "It's all right, boy," he murmured, though his own guard wasn't down yet. He turned to the woman. "You're a long way off the trail. Who are you?" She pulled down her hood, revealing a face flushed from cold, streaked with strands of grey blonde hair. "Linda Harper, freelance journalist. I write about people living off the grid, minimalist lifestyles, that kind of thing. I didn't think I'd actually find anyone up here." Her voice was genuine, not the slick tone of someone selling something. Ethan lowered the axe, though Shadow didn't relax until Ethan gave a quiet command. "You're looking at it," Ethan said. "One cabin, one man, one dog. That's the whole story." Linda's eyes swept the clearing, the patched roof, the stacked firewood, the determined dog standing like a sentry at Ethan's side. "If that's the whole story, it's a hell of a good one." Ethan almost laughed, but the sound caught in his throat. For months, he'd lived with nothing but storms and silence. To hear someone say his struggle was worth telling unsettled him more than the blizzard had. Over coffee at the cabin table, with Shadow watching every move, Linda listened. Ethan told her only fragments, losing his business, his wife leaving, ending up here with nothing but Shadow and a broken-down shelter. He skipped the rawest parts, but she caught enough. "You built this back from ruin," she said, scribbling notes. "Most people in your situation would have given up. But you didn't. That matters." Ethan shook his head. "I didn't do it alone. He wouldn't let me quit." He nodded toward Shadow, who lay stretched across the doorway like a living barricade. At the sound of his name, the shepherd lifted his head, ears flicking, eyes shining with something close to pride. Linda smiled. "Then it's a story about both of you." She stayed only a few hours, snapping photos of the cabin, the clearing, the dog standing tall against the mountain backdrop. When she finally strapped on her snowshoes again, she promised, "People need to hear this. They need to know it's possible to start over when everything's gone." Ethan watched her disappear into the trees, unsure if he'd ever see her again. But a week later, during his monthly supply run to the small town at the base of the ridge, he saw it. A local paper lay folded on the counter of Pete's hardware store. On the front page, "From ruin to renewal, Soldier and his K9 rebuild a life in the Montana wilderness." Beneath the headline was a photo Ethan leaning against the cabin wall, Shadow at his feet, both of them looking straight into the lens. The room seemed to tilt. He hadn't realized Linda would write so soon, or that anyone beyond the ridge would care. But they did. Within days, strangers began to trickle into town, asking about the man with the shepherd. Some drove up the mountain road, hoping to catch a glimpse of the cabin. Ethan turned most away, but a few, their eyes hollow with the same kind of loss he once carried, stayed long enough to talk. One man, a former banker who'd burned out and sold everything, stood in awe of the cabin's patched walls. "You found a way to keep going," he said. "Maybe I can too." Ethan didn't know what to say. He wasn't a teacher, wasn't a prophet. But each time someone left, Shadow pressed close to him, tail brushing his leg, as if reminding him that what they had built meant more than survival. It meant possibility. That night, as the fire crackled and the mountain stars burned overhead, Ethan sat on the porch with Shadow curled at his feet. For the first time since Rachel's letter, he felt something stir that wasn't despair or exhaustion. Purpose. He looked down at Shadow, whose ears twitched at the sound of owls in the trees. "Guess we're not just surviving anymore, huh?" The shepherd lifted his head, eyes reflecting the firelight, and Ethan swore he saw the answer there. They were just getting started. By summer, the cabin no longer looked like a ruin. The roof stood firm, the porch rebuilt, and the meadow had been cleared into a wide circle of grass where smoke curled from a steady fire pit. Word of Ethan and Shadow's survival had spread quietly, carried by Linda Harper's article and whispered among people restless with the weight of city lives. One by one, strangers began climbing the dirt road, not as tourists, but as seekers. The first group came in early June. A young couple from Oregon, tired of desk jobs. A retired teacher who wanted to feel useful again. a corporate lawyer whose eyes darted everywhere as if hunted by invisible chains. Ethan hesitated at first, but Shadow decided for him. The shepherd greeted them at the edge of the meadow, stiff at first, then softening when he caught the calm in their voices. Only then did Ethan let them stay. Days found them splitting wood, learning to patch walls, scavenging stone for a second fire pit. Ethan taught them the way he had once taught new soldiers, clear, direct, no wasted words. He showed them how to cut pine so it would season right, how to use rope to lift beams, how to listen for the sound of snow melt under the ice. Shadow was everywhere. He trotted between them like a silent inspector, barking when someone strayed too far into the trees, nudging hands when spirits flagged. At night, he stretched across the porch, keeping watch while the newcomers slept on bedrolls inside the cabin. "He's not just a dog," one of them whispered to Ethan. "He's the heart of this place." Ethan only nodded. He knew it was true. Then came the day Rachel appeared. It was late afternoon when Ethan spotted the silver SUV crawling up the dirt road, tires throwing dust. He froze, axe halfway to the woodpile. Shadow stiffened too, hackles rising, a growl starting low in his chest. When the door opened and Rachel stepped out in polished boots and designer sunglasses, Ethan felt the old life crash into the new like two colliding storms. She looked around the meadow, eyebrows arched. "So it's true. You're actually living out here," the others had gathered, curious but silent. Shadow placed himself in front of Ethan, gaze locked on Rachel, tail stiff. She frowned at the dog. "Still dragging him around?" "I thought you'd at least give that up." Ethan's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. He gave up on nothing. "Neither did I." Rachel circled the cabin, her eyes skimming over the patched logs, the stacked wood, the people working with steady rhythm. She laughed, sharp and disbelieving. "This is what you traded everything for. You lost a company, a marriage, a home, and for what? A shack in the woods?" Before Ethan could answer, Shadow barked once, deep and commanding, the sound echoing across the clearing. Every head turned. Rachel startled, her sunglasses slipping down her nose. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's back, steadying him. "It's not a shack," he said quietly. "It's a life. One I built with my own hands, with him at my side." Something shifted then. Rachel had come expecting the broken man she left behind, the one drowning in debt and despair. But standing before her was someone else, a man burned down to his core and rebuilt stronger, his voice grounded, his presence steady. "You don't even look like the same person," she muttered. "I'm not," Ethan replied. "And you're not part of this chapter." For a long moment, silence hung heavy. Then Rachel gave a cold smile, as if dismissing what she couldn't understand. She turned back to her SUV without another word. The sound of the engine faded down the mountain road until the meadow was quiet again. The group looked to Ethan, waiting. He only bent, pressing his forehead to Shadow's. The shepherd's steady breath grounded him in the present. That night, as firelight danced against the cabin walls, Ethan sat with the others. They shared food, laughter, stories of mistakes and second chances. Shadow moved among them, settling finally at Ethan's side, eyes glowing in the firelight. Ethan lifted his cup, his voice carrying not just to the people around the fire, but to the memory of the man he used to be. "We're not running anymore. We're building." Together, Shadow gave a soft huff, resting his head on Ethan's boot, sealing the vow. The tide had turned. And for the first time, Ethan believed it was not just survival anymore. It was the beginning of something far greater. The fire pit still glowed from the night before, faint smoke curling upward into the cold dawn when Ethan stirred. He rubbed his hands together, watching the horizon bleed orange over the Montana ridges. Shadow sat at his side, ears pricked, nose twitching at the scents carried on the morning air. The world was quiet, but inside Ethan's chest something stirred that was far from stillness. The article had spread further than he ever imagined. Linda's words, about a broken man who rebuilt himself with a loyal dog in the wilderness, had been shared across veteran forums, minimalist living blogs, and even a national podcast. Strangers wrote to him, some desperate, some simply curious. They weren't looking for adventure. They were searching for healing. One night, while flipping through a small pile of those letters by lantern light, the idea came like a strike of lightning. He looked at Shadow, curled tight by the fire. What if this wasn't just our fight anymore, boy? What if we built something for them too? Shadow raised his head, eyes steady, as if the question had already been answered. Ethan spent days pacing the meadow, boots carving paths into the grass. He thought about the other soldiers he knew, the ones who came home but never really came back. Men who drank too much, who sat in dark rooms with shades drawn, who never trusted silence again. What if Shadow Ridge could be more than a home? What if it could be a sanctuary, a school, a place where veterans could trade nightmares for purpose? The name came to him on the third night. He whispered it aloud, testing it against the wind. Shadow Ridge Institute. Shadow, hearing his name, thumped his tail and stretched with a low groan, as if signing off on the vision. Ethan wasted no time. He drew plans by hand at the cabin table. Outlines for new cabins, training grounds, a communal fire circle, even a small workshop where skills like carpentry and masonry could be taught. He wanted a place where veterans could work with their hands, sweat into the soil, and leave with more than scars. But dreams, Ethan knew, cost more than sweat. He had no savings left, only the steady trickle of donations from visitors who insisted on giving something after their stay. He told himself the idea was foolish, another construction project doomed before it began. Yet he couldn't shake the urgency. Then the unexpected happened. One crisp September afternoon, a black SUV rolled into the meadow. Ethan tensed, half expecting Rachel to step out again. Shadow moved ahead, low growl rumbling until Ethan's sharp whistle stopped him. The door opened, and out stepped an older man in a simple wool coat, his gait slow but firm. His eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen too many battles, though Ethan sensed they weren't from war. The man introduced himself as Daniel Harper, Linda's father, a philanthropist, semi-retired, who had poured money into community projects across the country. "My daughter won't stop talking about you," Daniel said with a half smile. "Says you've done something out here most men can't. Turned rock bottom into solid ground." Ethan's throat tightened. "I just built a roof that doesn't leak." Daniel shook his head. "You built more than that. You built proof. Proof that men can come back from the edge." They sat by the fire that evening. Ethan, hesitant but driven, laid out his vision for Shadow Ridge Institute. He didn't pitch it like a businessman. He spoke like a soldier giving his after-action report, raw and direct. The suicides among veterans, the broken families, the need for a place not built by institutions, but by men who'd been there themselves. He pointed to Shadow. "He wakes me from nightmares. He reminds me when to stand tall. This dog gave me back my life. What if every veteran had a place and maybe even a partner like him to anchor them again?" For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. He reached down, scratching Shadow's head. The shepherd leaned into the touch, eyes closing, a quiet acceptance that broke through the weight of silence. Finally, Daniel spoke. "You're right. This isn't a project. It's a mission." Ethan blinked, unsure he'd heard right. Daniel continued. "I can fund the first phase. Cabins, supplies, training grounds, not as a handout, but as an investment. I want to see if men will actually come. If they do, we'll build more shock coursed through Ethan. His entire body went still except for his hand pressed firmly into Shadow's fur, grounding himself. After months of scraping by, living from firewood to firewood, the possibility of real resources felt like a gust of wind filling sails he hadn't realized were waiting. But Daniel wasn't finished. "There's one condition," he said, his eyes sharpened, testing Ethan. "This place can't become a circus. It must stay true raw, real, honest. No branding slogans, no polished brochures, just truth. Men will see through anything else." Ethan met his gaze, the soldier in him recognizing the weight of a command. "Then truth is what they'll get." That night, lying in the rebuilt cabin, Ethan couldn't sleep. He replayed every word, every possibility. He turned to Shadow, who was sprawled across the doorway, ears twitching in dreams. "We're not just rebuilding ourselves anymore," Ethan whispered. "We're building for them." Shadow's tail thumped against the floorboards once, steady, as if promising he'd stand watch over this new mission too. For the first time since Rachel's letter, Ethan let himself feel it fully. Not just survival, not just rebuilding, but vision. From ashes a fire was rising, and at its heart stood a soldier and his K9, ready to turn one broken cabin into a sanctuary that could change lives. The snow fell soft that evening, blanketing the valley in a hush so complete it felt as if the world itself had paused to breathe. From the ridge, the glow of cabins flickered like a constellation against the darkness. What had once been a ruin was now Shadow Ridge Institute, an award-winning retreat valued at more than $10 million. Veterans, families, and even civilians seeking healing filled the new cabins and workshops. Yet at the heart of it all stood the same log cabin where one broken man and his loyal K9 had first held the line against despair. Ethan stood on the porch, hand resting on the rail he had built with raw pine years earlier. His breath fogged in the cold air, but his chest was warm with something deeper than fire could provide. Shadow, now graying around the muzzle, padded silently beside him, gaze sweeping the grounds as if counting every soul under his protection. From one of the new lodges, laughter rose deep, rolling, the kind that belonged to men who had not laughed in years. Somewhere, a guitar strummed, clumsy but joyful. Ethan closed his eyes, letting the sound seep into him. It was proof. They had done more than survive. They had built life back from ashes. Inside, the old cabin still smelled of cedar and wood smoke. Despite the $1 million expansions outside, Ethan refused to replace its rough-hewn walls or the scarred floorboards Shadow had once scratched through restless nights. He sat before the stone fireplace, the flames dancing in amber light. Shadow settled at the doorway, the same place he had guarded since the very first night. "We made it," Ethan whispered, the words falling somewhere between prayer and promise. Shadow lifted his head, ears twitching, eyes glinting with the fire's reflection. His tail brushed the floor once solid, certain as if to say, "We always would." But even in this piece, life never stood still. Earlier that week, Ethan had received a letter from a veteran's widow. She wrote about how her husband had spent his final months here, working the soil, carving wood, sitting by Shadow's side. He smiled again before the end. She wrote, "You gave me back a piece of him I thought I had lost forever." Ethan read it twice before setting it gently in a box filled with similar letters. Each one was a reminder that the mission was far greater than himself. And yet, he still lived simply. No luxury cars, no tailored suits, no mansion beyond the cabins they had built. He slept on the same bed frame he had hammered together from salvaged planks. He chopped his own firewood, hauled water when the pumps froze, and let Shadow lead him on long hikes into the timberline where silence was pure. The world might measure Shadow Ridge at $10 million, but Ethan measured it in heartbeats, in stories, in the soft weight of Shadow's head on his knee when the night grew heavy. A sudden gust rattled the windows. Ethan stirred, listening to the wind clawing at the mountainside. For a fleeting moment, it reminded him of the first winter siege, the storm that nearly broke him. He looked toward Shadow, who had lifted his head, alert but calm, eyes steady on him. That look had anchored Ethan once before, kept him alive when he was ready to let go. It still held him now. The fire cracked, sparks spiraling up the chimney. Ethan leaned back in his chair, letting the warmth seep into his bones. He thought of the road that had brought him here. Bankruptcy, betrayal, the long nights of doubt, the bear tearing through his food, the storms that tested every ounce of grit. And through it all, Shadow had been there, never wavering. The shepherd shifted, ears pricking at a distant sound, footsteps crunching snow outside. Ethan smiled. It would be one of the new arrivals, stepping out for air, marveling at the silence. Soon more would come. Men and women searching for what he had once searched for. A reason to keep going. Shadow Ridge would welcome them because it wasn't just about Ethan anymore. It was about every soul who needed to stand on solid ground again. Ethan whispered once more. Softer now, more to himself than to anyone else. We made it, boy. And tomorrow, we start again. Shadow stretched, lowered his head onto his paws, and kept his post at the doorway. Outside, snow kept falling, each flake settling like a quiet vow that this place, this bond, would endure. And now, as the story rests here in the quiet of the Montana night, I'll leave you with this question. What's your story with a loyal pet? If Shadow and Ethan's journey moved you, share your own in the comments, and don't forget to support our channel German Shepherd so more stories of courage, loyalty, and second chances can reach those who need them most.